Thank you so much for joining us for this session with Jason Lange and Adrianna Chrestopoulos on how to sustainably fund teacher pipeline development. We are recording and we will send out that video to you in email after the event. And we are also reserving some time at the end for Q&A. So feel free to drop those questions into the Zoom Q&A and our speakers will follow along. They'll answer as they go, and also they'll address those questions at the end of the hour. So just a quick introduction, Jason Lange is the founder and president of BloomBoard, a talent development provider that is helping transform educator prep by partnering with school districts and universities to bring teaching degree and certification programs into K-12 classrooms. Prior to founding BloomBoard, Jason worked in private equity. He was also a member of the New Schools Venture Fund team, where he supported the development of the initial EdTech investment thesis for the New Schools Seed Fund, now Reach Capital. Adrianna leads strategic initiatives at BloomBoard, where she collaborates with senior leadership to define priorities and develop roadmaps for sustainable educator pipelines and systems. Adrianna has spearheaded national programs, including launching teacher apprenticeship degree programs and advising on workforce development funding strategies. Previously, as a project director across numerous engagements, she managed large-scale education initiatives, including the state of Texas's instructional materials review and approval process, development of Florida's Institute for the Professional Development of Adult Educators Integrated Education and Training Program Playbook, and implementation and facilitation of teacher prep communities of practice in collaboration with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So thank you all for being here, and I'm going to pass the mic to Jason and Adrianna.
Love it. Thank you very much, Erin. Really appreciate it. Super excited to have you all. We got a pretty massive group and a bunch of really sort of fun names and sort of blasts from the past here. So thanks y'all for joining us. Really excited about the conversation here, right? As we've been sort of going through our work, obviously post-ESSER, right? This question of, right, how do we really sort of think about funding and what are the sort of various opportunities for funding, right? I know and realize this is going to be a state-specific conversation at times, and this is going to be sort of a national landscape conversation at times. And so we will try to bounce back and forth. Want to make sure you all can use the chat, use the Q&A to ask questions. Again, we've been deeper in a lot of this than I think most anybody in the country at this point. And so really excited to sort of just share what we're seeing and what we're sort of learning. And again, trying to help the field figure out sort of what are some of these sort of pathways for funding in the process. As Erin mentioned, so my name is Jason. I'm the founder, president for BloomBoard. So I have been in the investment banking, finance, private equity sort of side of the world that is incredibly soulless and sad. But really sort of ultimately ended up in really trying to figure out at Stanford, right, sort of how do we use technology to train and scale the highest quality instruction for all kids? And so I have spent the past 15 years really trying to sort of do anything and everything to sort of achieve that mission. And I really think in the last several years here, as we've gotten into higher ed and as we've really started to think about this sort of shift in moving degrees into jobs and creating these on-the-job degree pathways, it has unlocked a whole new sort of not only a way to reconstitute the teacher pipeline in the face of the teacher shortage, but also really redefine how we think about, right, sort of pipelines, how we think about sort of funding these pipelines, given access to a bunch of new sort of funding sources and a bunch of new, much more sustainable sort of structures. And so from an overall standpoint, I thought I'd give a little bit of background on just sort of how we think about the world and some of the expertise we're bringing. And then Adrianna does amazing work in trying to navigate a bunch of the sort of craziness of funding from the workforce board standpoint, from the Department of Labor standpoint. And so really want to sort of leverage her perspective and expertise here to just share a lot. And as we're going through this, again, feel free to please put in questions in the chat, put in questions in the Q&A, we'll monitor that and get going. So super quick background on our world, right? We have spent many years trying to figure out sort of technology in sort of teacher, right, sort of development. And in particular, how do we use videos? So the micro-credential movement, how do we use videos to really help train and scale the best instruction? And ultimately what we started to run into is just the shortage being really, really pervasive and causing all sorts of issues. And so a lot of our work has shifted into, well, where are we going to find the next generation of teachers, right? We know the attrition rates are as high as they've been. Ed prep enrollment is as low as it's been. And so this idea that we're sort of starting to be able to sort of create pathways to really bring paras, classified staff, long-term subs into the profession. And when we've surveyed now tens of thousands of them, right, we hear over and over and over again, right, that there are vast majority of folks actually would like to be in fully certified teaching roles, and that they are locked out because of cost and because of time. And obviously this cost question, as we're going to spend sort of at length here, the time barriers are one that we have also really spent a lot of time trying to figure out, and in that the way that we go about that. So we now have 14 going on 16 university partners. We're actually, according to US News and World Reports now, we are the 11th largest school of ed in the country across our portfolio of of higher ed partners, if we were our own school of ed, which we're not. But we are sort of really trying to think about how do we change the delivery model of higher ed? And in particular, how do we sort of build it in a way so that we can actually confer degrees on the job? And the ability to sort of take a 3-credit course and change it into a 3-portfolio course and not have to have a candidate do nights and weekends courses or online courses at home for 3-hour blocks, right? We've removed those limitations and we've been able to create a much more accessible pathway to be able to earn those degrees by building 3 portfolios for each of those courses. And so you build those portfolios, including your lesson plans, your videos, your student work, and that we're able to then have our faculty in our CAPE accredited universities that are fully approved DPPs confer actual degrees and licensures based on that set of portfolios, that set of artifacts. And so that's changed, I think, a lot of what we have learned about just sort of the equity and the access into our candidate pools. You know, we are working across the country in several of the largest districts, right? Sort of Palm Beach, Orange County, DeKalb, trying to get a bunch of stuff up in Charlotte, Meck, and other sort of places, all the way down to tiny rural districts. And so we know that this applies to everyone, and it's been very interesting to see what that looks like. And we've really seen some pretty amazing results, right? 60+% of our application pool today is our candidates of color, 70+% are low income, and yet we still maintain a 95% completion retention rate. And so that's a pretty amazing way to think about how can we diversify the workforce, how can we really improve the quality of the instruction that our candidates and support that our candidates are getting as they're learning to be great teachers. And then in particular to this conversation, how do we actually really sort of think about funding and think about ways to sustainably fund these programs that can last? And often what we're doing on the BloomBoard side of the world is we're sort of almost sitting in between, right, our higher ed partners and our district partners, and really trying to help create a lot of these systems to both fund, but also to implement the overall work. And so before we jump into the funding side, I thought I'd give just a really quick sense to give you a sense of like, how do we do this, right? And the core of our world is we are basically we've created a very portfolio-centric curriculum and an implementation and a learning management sort of structures that is the basis for all of the courses that our candidates are in. And so if you're a candidate, you're going from associate to bachelor's degree, that's 60 credits. We've helped our university partners turn that into 60 portfolios, and you're working on those portfolios. And so you can graduate with a bachelor's in special ed in those 60 portfolios in 2 years. And we've been able to sort of create the sort of process to manage that, and that we're using all of the data that we're tracking, because every click happens in our system. We're using that data to run sort of a residency management structure at the bachelor's level, which is obviously pretty exciting and pretty important to help manage and create that 95% completion retention rate. And then we align it all to licensure, right, which we know is super key in terms of making sure folks have their ESL and the reading endorsements, all the sort of the keys that they need. We have this whole funding playbook support, so we'll talk through a bunch of that today in the process. And then we also help with a bunch of the recruitment selection, and we're even helping make the system faster. So in September, we worked with one of our higher ed partners to launch the first ever 0 to 120 credit bachelor's in special ed, bachelor's in elementary ed. And our candidates can now do that program in 3 years on an accelerated basis. So it's the first ever 3-year bachelor's that covers the full 120, but we can do it as part of your job. And then those candidates are taking their gen eds over the summers, and they're able to confer a degree on an accelerated basis, which obviously has lots of pretty exciting implications for how we can recruit recent high school grads, how we can recruit from our communities in the process. And so that's been pretty amazing and pretty exciting to see as it's going to come together. And that as we've been doing a lot of that work, we've already started to see this sort of models of how we're training teachers evolve. And many of you all are probably aware of the teacher apprenticeship. So 2 years ago, 2+ years ago, teaching was put on the apprenticeshipable occupation list with the Department of Labor. I think the early implementations, at least what we've seen, what we've heard, the early implementations of teacher apprenticeship programs were mostly trying to close some distance gaps, right? And so we saw universities say, well, here's new funding I can use to help create more pathways for teachers. I'll host nights and weekends courses on, at the school sites, or I'll try and make them a little bit more flexible. And unfortunately, I don't think we really solved the crux of the time issues there. And so a lot of our world has been trying to figure out how do we sort of make this not just sort of a little bit more convenient while still locking out a lot of candidates. Because if you're working full time as a para, you probably have a second or a third job, and you probably have a sort of family at home. And so it makes the ability to get through and persist in these programs really hard. And what we know already is that where we're able to create a much more job embedded approach to that degree, we unlock all of those sort of time barriers. And so this is really what's pulled us into and led us into a lot of the work in the Department of Labor side of things, because the moment your degree can start to have already embedded in it a lot of the on-the-job training that we'll talk about, and a lot of the related training and instruction that we'll talk about here, all of a sudden, right, your degree and your job are really becoming the exact same experience. And that unlocks a whole next generation of what teaching and what I think the sort of teacher workforce can look like, especially given a world where, Gen Z candidates are much more reticent to take on a bunch of debt, reticent to not really know what they're going into, and want to be able to have an impact in life. And so this is a pretty amazing opportunity for us to take advantage of the process. So with that sort of context, want to sort of get into this key question, right? If you've spent any time in the apprenticeship side of the world, right, what comes up over and over again is this idea of, right, we're trying to braid funding. And this idea that braided funding from multiple sources can really start to sort of anchor and really help us think about ways to drive the district's budget contribution down. That's really the ultimate goal. And so as we've started going through this, right, if we think about sort of the broader lens of, right, tuition in a degree program, right, or in a certification pathway, but ultimately it's sort of the same structure, which is how many credits does a candidate need to get certified and get their license and get the degree, and what's the cost per credit in that program? Most of our higher ed partners are, $450 to $550 a credit, $500 a credit hour. And so that typically ends up in something like $13,500, $15,000 as total tuition per year that the candidate would ultimately, right, that would need to be covered to engage and pay for that degree. What we've then been able to do is say, well, how would we break that 15 grand at 13,500 down, and what various sort of contributions can be created to allow for this braiding of the process? The first is really just candidate access to aid. Right, vast majority of our candidates, because, right, they're coming from more marginalized backgrounds, because they're working and they don't have bachelor's degrees and they haven't accessed Pell before, right? Vast majority of them are very heavily Pell eligible. And so it's a way for districts to sort of embed, right, a job embedded degree, and for candidates to take advantage of state and federal aid as part of those programs. And so we make that one of those sort of expected candidate contributions so that candidates are sort of engaged in that process in filling out FAFSA and going through the work. And if you have candidates in any, right, the master's degree level work obviously doesn't have sort of Pell and the like. In many cases, there's some apprenticeship funding we'll talk through in a second here, because the next big bucket of funding is really these sort of state set-asides, right? And so the ability for states to set aside funding specifically for teacher apprenticeship or for teacher vacancies. So a whole bunch of states now have the SAFE grants that they've been able to sort of procure, and they're now doling those funds out in various forms through various RFPs and various grants to be able to sort of help subsidize the degree pathways, help subsidize the tuition as part of these programs. And so we're seeing that those funds are typically, anywhere from, right, a couple $1,000 to 15 grand a candidate, which is obviously a pretty interesting sizable chunk. And Adrianna here will talk here a bunch about sort of how those funds have come about and what that looks like. There is another very large bucket of funding on the Department of Labor side, on the workforce funding side, that comes from WIOA, which is this Workforce Opportunities Investment Opportunities Act. It's really about, right, sort of how is the formula funding for the Department of Labor doled out to the states, and then how does that funding get sort of pushed down into the local departments of labor or the local workforce development boards. and that we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. And then really the final bucket is, right, what's the district responsibility? And so we're seeing districts really get creative right now in terms of how they're going about sort of managing these different sort of contributions, whether it's from title funding, whether it's, ESSER extensions, if you still got them, congrats, right? Most don't. But right, the idea is, right, we know that there's a lot of different sort of funding options. And then we have folks, I'll show you here in a second, some pay differential structures that we're finding folks are using in states where they have a little bit more flexibility with sort of long-term subs. And that's created some interesting pathways. And then we have districts that are actually doing future salary holdbacks and being creative in that process. And so we can talk a little bit about what that looks like. But if we were just taking this as, right, sort of an example, right, one of the biggest opportunities is this idea that in many cases, right, there's a pretty strong gap between what you're paying and what you're budgeting for a fully staffed educator in a district and what you're paying the per diem on a long-term sub or on, right, sort of whatever ways that you're solving that vacancy today. And that lapsed salary is effectively funding that's sitting in in the general fund that is very accessible, right? And you may have to argue for it, right? It's certainly probably being utilized today in some capacity, but what a better way to use that lapsed salary than to pay for your future teacher pipeline to fill that vacancy permanently. And so that what we're often trying to do with our higher ed partners is how do we sort of think about that sort of lapsed salary? How do we think about that differential? And can we use that funding as one of the key buckets to help pay for, right, the actual tuition, knowing that this, that overall 13.5 is still less than, the actual, right, sort of lapsed salary in its own case, often outright. And so we have districts, right, in Florida, we have districts where literally, if you're doing school-based budgeting, where principals are competing and really sort of starting to get pretty competitive for candidates, because the idea is, right, the salary gap in between what they're paying a budgeted vacancy and what they're paying an associate teacher in that role can be 20, 30 grand. And then all of a sudden, right, we have principals who are literally making 13 grand back in their budget for every vacancy they fill with one of these associate teachers. And that creates a really sustainable mechanism in the process. And so that's one sort of specific example from a long-term sub, right, associate teacher sort of category that we know if you have that option, it's definitely something you should be looking at today in trying to figure that out. And if we go through this in, right, some normal course of, right, what does this actually look like? Initially out of the gate, if you were let's take workforce funding because we're going to spend a bunch of time there off the table for the moment. Initially, if you were looking at, right, as sort of a candidate contribution at the national average of Pell, that would probably be somewhere around $4,100, right? That's sort of the national average for Pell these days. And that, especially given that the candidate pools often skew a little bit more diverse and more, sort of marginalized, right? We've seen districts have higher average contributions than 4,100. But then, right, all of a sudden now you're looking at, well, does that pay differential in that lapsed salary, can that cover the remaining 7, 8, 9 grand, right? Is there title funding for, right, ESL or special ed that can cover some of that? Are there future salary holdbacks where you say, okay, well, you're already committing, all of our candidates commit to at least a 3, 4, 5-year employment offer. And so if you say, well, if you're going to go from making $30,000 to $60,000 the day you graduate, that's pretty exciting. And so if I pay you $57,000 and hold back some of that to recoup the cost of the degree, right, we find that candidates obviously don't push back on that because it's still life-changing economics. And that's one of these other ways to really sort of think about the overall structure and think about that sort of process. So, really the goal here is, right, that's just using existing district funds and using your sort of normal creativity that you can in the process. So any questions before we jump into the workforce side? Any questions about sort of the lap salary, that pay differential, the sort of salary holdback side of things? The shortage statistics, we can put a link in. We have a bunch of the data on some of it's state specific, some of it's nationwide. I think that the first slide I was talking about sort of attrition, there's a bunch of Illinois scorecard data that's actually pretty well represented on teacher shortage and district superintendent sort of perspective on attrition rates and the like. Margo, you have a question? Sorry, Mario, can you hear me? So if you can put your question in the chat, happy to make sure we sort of have a chance to answer it there. So now, right, so if we think about, right, the goal is if we know that there's some level of district subsidy, right, that we can sort of come by based on lap salary business, the question is, right, in the corporate world, in workforce, in apprenticeship programs, there are lots of examples where workforce funding is helping substantially subsidize these programs. And whether that's, right, candidates, right, we have districts in Illinois right now where they're getting 50% of the tuition contribution from the district covered by the local workforce board. And there's obviously lots of examples in the corporate world where, you know, in many cases, the entire cost of the training, because it's upskilling or because it's sort of apprenticeship based, is being covered by the workforce board. And so I think this is really the big, right, sort of unknown, and the sort of the thing that has the most promise right now is how do we drive the district cost down to less than $5,000 a candidate and be able to sort of create some sustainability by plugging into some of these workforce funds. And so what we thought we'd do is sort of take that sort of structure, really have sort of Adrianna here come in, and Adrianna, I'll let you sort of give a little of your background introduction, and then really be able to sort of talk through, right, sort of what you have learned in the process and what you need to, what districts should be thinking about as they're trying to navigate some of these structures.
Thanks, Jason. I'm going to go ahead and take over sharing as well, if that works.
Perfect.
Hi, everybody. My name is Adrianna Chrestopoulos. As Aaron mentioned earlier, my role at BloomBoard is managing our strategic initiatives, which includes thinking through this new world that local education agencies have found themselves in, of being both the employer of fully certified teachers, but also the oftentimes preparer and strategizer around their talent pipeline, where that was really previously kind of fully completed by local higher education partners, colleges and universities. We obviously are in a different world now, and workforce partners are going to be super important wealths of knowledge. Some of our actual workforce partners that we are working with districts across the country are on this call today. Hi, everybody. Good to see you. And they, you know, definitely have a huge role to play in funding, but I'll share a little bit more about some of the other areas in which they have a ton of expertise as well. So I'm going to start with what is a local workforce development board. There are going to be a number of acronyms that I'm going to share with you all today. At any point, if you have forgotten what one means, please go ahead and type it into the chat. Jason or I can provide some more insight on that. But you'll hear me call these local workforce development boards LWDBs, or simply workforce boards. And they are the connector between all businesses and employers in a local area with strategies, with partnerships. They really support your regional economy, and they have been operating for hundreds of years in the background. If you have never seen them, they are still doing their work silently, kind of in the background, but they really support career pathways across all industries and focus on job services for citizens in the community. They typically are county-based coverage, and so you can see in both Illinois and Pennsylvania the map of coverage by particular county. The number of counties a board serves varies, as does the total number of boards in a state. But on the education side, you can think of them like an ROE, an ESC, an IU, a BOCES, whatever your state calls kind of that service center for school districts in a region. You can think of a workforce board as that for businesses and employers in a group of counties or a county. Like I mentioned, they conduct some of that labor market and workforce data analysis, which can be really helpful for school districts. They share a lot of workforce pipeline promising practices. They ensure appropriate use of workforce funds, and then they provide career services. Sometimes those career services are provided by another partner. Some of the terms that you might see if you're looking up your workforce board are like a one-stop center or a career navigator. Those are just other partners in the workforce system. And, as I mentioned previously, as our kind of traditional supply of teachers coming to local education agencies is dwindling, you all, district and ESC folks, have taken charge of planning, implementing, evaluating your educator pipelines. Employers of other industries, you can think of construction, you can think of tech, you can think of IT, nursing, have had the support of these workforce boards in developing their talent pipelines for decades. They provide a number of services that are super invaluable to a variety of industries in developing talent pipelines, like marketing and recruiting members of the community to become potential employees or to become potential educators for school district purposes. They provide both sustainable and recurring funding for program implementation, which is especially important in this new world of teacher apprenticeship programs, where often funding sources are grab and go. These are sustainable and recurring funding sources that school districts can start to partner with workforce boards to take advantage of. And they also provide direct to participant services for qualifying participants. A lot of our participants at districts need childcare support, transportation support, and for qualifying participants, workforce boards can provide some of those wraparound services as well. Before I get into more detail on some of the funding specific pieces, do we have any questions on what a local workforce board is or what their purpose is? Let me check and see.
I would say if you have not, right, this is one of those relationships right now that vast majority, right, probably 95+% of districts in the country have never spoken to the workforce board. This should be, if anything, if you take only one thing away from this webinar, this should be a chance, right, and a sort of bit of a call to action to say, it is very important, and it will be important in the future, that you reach out, or your soup reaches out to whoever that local workforce board is, to introduce yourself and talk about the work you're doing and the needs that you have from hiring. What's funny is most workforce boards don't necessarily realize that their school districts are the largest employers in their entire community. And the idea that school districts haven't realized that they could actually tap into funding there, that's a huge disconnect today. And so that should be number one sort of takeaway. If you haven't done that today, you can do that right now while we're sharing, but it's definitely an important sort of part of the overall conversation, because it is a relationship, sort of process in its own right.
And I'll share a resource that can help you identify your local workforce development board. But oftentimes, I mean, it's a pretty simple Google my county local workforce development board or workforce center, and they can get you that will get you there. But at the end, I'll talk about the specific kind of staff member that you should try to connect with at your workforce board to get the most information to them and start that partnership process. For now, I am going to go into more specifics about the funding source. And as Jason mentioned, over and above, the number one most important takeaway here is going to be reaching out to your local workforce board. The next couple of slides are going to give you some talking points to say to them, hey, I went to this webinar, I learned a little bit about what you all do. So, this can be some just kind of fodder for agenda for that conversation. Jason mentioned this acronym earlier, Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. This is the federal title funds that flow through the federal Department of Labor into states and then through to your workforce board. Similar to how school districts receive annual funding that is formula funded through the Department of Education, the Department of Labor sends flow through funding to support federal job training and then those related programs. We see this in the form of American Job Centers, one-stops, or workforce boards. Those will be the names on the outside of the building or on the website. The funding is flowing directly from the federal government or USDOL to each state workforce agency. The state workforce agency in your state might be the Department of Labor and Industry, the Department of Commerce, the Department of Economics. That varies, but that department will take, similar to the Department of Education in your state, they have a portion of funding that they are allocated. Oftentimes, that is where these state set-aside grants come from for registered apprenticeship programs. But that state workforce agency also develops process for allocating funding down to the local boards, and that is formula-based. If you are super curious about how the funding is allocated based on formulas, you can access that in your state WIOA plan. It is very dense reading, so I would be more than happy to connect with you to try to figure that out, but that is really getting into the weeds. Most of the funding pots that your local entity, your American Job Center, your regional or your county's one-stop or workforce board are going to have are these kind of funding pots or funding streams. Each local workforce development board does get to set its own policy, so they may have policies that differ from what we talk about today. This is not one size fits all, but it is pretty centered around what policy dictates each workforce board makes available to local employers. And those include individualized training accounts, or you'll hear me call those ITAs, on-the-job learning or on-the-job training funds, customized training, and incumbent worker training, or IWT. The next slide is going to talk a little bit more about each of these funding sources. But one note is that WIOA was just reauthorized in 2024. There will be some tweaks that come to some of these, but as you know, all of our kind of advocacy organizations are analyzing those. This is what was first made available with WIOA in its authorization in 2014. With those particular funding streams, an ITA, the important thing to remember about an ITA is that this is funds attached to an individual participant, and that individual participant must be eligible for them. If you would like to talk more about what that eligibility looks like, I can answer that question later on. But important thing to know about ITAs is that the funding is attached to that one participant, and they need to be designated as eligible for that funding by the Workforce Development Board, typically through demonstration of financial need or demonstration of need in terms of additional academic support. On-the-job learning or on-the-job training is training by an employer, so in this case, a school district, that is provided to the participant. The employer, through an on-the-job training fund, can be reimbursed in up to 50% of the participant's wage rate. Customized training is just exactly what it sounds like. It's very customized. The terms of it are specific to the partnership between the workforce board or organization and the district. The funding amount is customized and it follows the local workforce board's policy. Incumbent worker training is also exactly what it sounds like. It's a training program for current employees or current staff at a school district with at least 6 months of history with that district. Employers pay for a share of training in accordance with the size of their staff, and then they are reimbursed for the remainder of training costs. Most often what this looks like with a school district, typically school districts have more than 100 employees, so school districts are responsible for 50% of tuition, and then the workforce board can reimburse 50% of the remainder of those actual costs. What we have seen in the workforce world and with our school district partners is that ITAs and IWT are the most common forms of funding that workforce boards have available and that fit teacher apprenticeship or on-the-job degree programs most closely. I do want to make one note here. There's a lot of kind of noise in the field around registered apprenticeship programs, and I want to be very clear that this workforce funding that is available is not the same as registered apprenticeship funding. A registered apprenticeship program can take advantage of these workforce funds and can absolutely partner with their local workforce board to access these funding streams, but it is not required. Again, the only thing that is required for someone to be able to take advantage or access an ITA is that that individual is seeking training services and they select an eligible provider of training. We can talk again more offline about what that looks like in more detail, but that does not require a registered apprenticeship program. Neither does on-the-job learning. It could be any employer that is providing on-the-job training to their candidates or to their trainees. Same with customized training and same with incumbent worker training. On the note of ITAs, for your training, if you are implementing a training program for, let's say, your paraprofessionals to become teachers at your school district, in order for that training to be eligible for an ITA, for you to be that eligible provider of training, you have to be on your state's eligible training provider list. You can do this in one of two ways. You can apply directly for the state ETPL, or you can apply to become a registered apprenticeship program. You don't have to be a registered apprenticeship program, but that will get you on the ETPL so that you can access ITAs. Otherwise, unless indicated by local board policy or by board preference, all of these other funding streams, like I mentioned, are eligible to any training provider, any training program, no ETPL necessary, no registered apprenticeship programs necessary. So I don't want you to think that because you hear the word apprenticeship program, that your training program might not be eligible for any of these. This is the only indicator of eligibility across the board for any of these funding streams. Again, unless your local workforce board has a different policy, which you could speak to them about when you reach out to them. I just have one more specific kind of action item to share, which is going to answer that first question that we got, and then I'm going to go into the questions that we've gotten since. So you can find your local workforce development board using Career One Stop's Workforce Development Board Finder, or you can simply Google them. That's pretty much how, when we have a district partner, I will find their county, I will look up Workforce Development Board in that county, and then I will look at the staff page and find either a program manager, a WEOA director, or a business partnerships specialist person. And I will email them and I will ask for a meeting. And I will say, hey, I'm at this school district. This is my position. I'd like to talk with you about our training program, share my availability. Our workforce board partners are super eager to hear what is going on at school districts, and often school districts and workforce boards have not had adult training program partnerships. You might discover by asking people at your district that there is a partnership with your local workforce board for your high school students who are participating in career exploration services, or anything else. That's a great place to start, to say, hey, our district and our workforce board already have a partnership, but we're looking to extend it to our current staff population. And they really want to hear more about your talent needs. What are you already doing to support your teacher talent pipeline? What shortage areas do you have? They are an excellent connector to other initiatives in the state, in the region, that can support your talent pipeline. Or if you are interested in learning about how BloomBoard can help, what we do with our school district and other kind of ESC ROE partners is I will lead the facilitation of all of these meetings with your workforce development specialists. So I could provide you, a draft email template. I will run the meeting, and of course you will be there, but I'll kind of support the translation of the workforce jargon for you. And then we will go through the process of applying and soliciting some of those funds and developing that longer term partnership with your workforce board side by side. I am going to take a look at some of the questions that we have in the Q&A.
So I would say the couple things just to sort of echo,
Yep.
right, is one is like, I think what we found is, right, the workforce boards are really excited often to learn that there are ways that they can support, right, some of these high need, especially high need teacher, right, licensure pathways, right? The teacher shortage is pervasive, and behind the scenes, workforce boards have a lot of diversity, a lot of high demand, right, sort of requirements. And so they are actively looking to find ways to spend money on bringing candidates, right, especially more marginalized, right, more diverse candidates, into high need, high demand professions. And teaching is pretty widely regarded, right, as sort of one of these sort of key areas that they're often very excited to connect with. And so I just want to sort of reinforce that, since we haven't had that question. Jamie Lynn, you had a question in the Q&A about sort of, right, this idea of double dipping. And so yes, certainly if you're trying to access, you don't have to go back to the sort of the full list. If you're trying to access multiple of these sources of funding for the same candidates, right, that's generally not gonna work, right? That's not gonna fly. But just the fact that you're getting, not totally sure from your question, the fact that you're just getting state funding through your state Department of Education, right, does not in any way preclude you from getting funding from your workforce board just because it's also state funds, right? If you're getting funding from your one-stop, right, if you're getting other funding and you're paying for candidates, it typically is often at the candidate level. So we've even seen districts that have multiple apprenticeships that are getting multiple sources of funding covering candidates, but right, they're not commingling or they're not double dipping on the funding for the same candidate. And so that's really sort of why this really does, right? The funding often traces all the way down. And if we want to get into the joys of the reporting side of this, which we will talk about, I'll have a blog post here shortly on just how painful some of the reporting can be. And so we do recommend that you sort of try and find some intermediary, some sort of helpful support there. But again, right, the reporting is tracked all the way down to the candidate level. And that's really what sort of the Department of Labor uses to make sure that there's not that double dipping. But there's nothing that precludes you from funding candidates if you don't have other sources of funding that would preclude you. And often what we find is it is a little bit of a workforce board exposure, right? How workforce boards think about funding can be fuzzy. And often you might hear some folks say like, oh, I don't think we can do that. And then you talk to another workforce board and they're like, oh yeah, we do that for this sort of thing. And then you just got to connect the two of them and they will talk it out and figure out exactly what structures they're using to fund what. And so we find it's a pretty interesting, right? Because it's such a local control question, it is often just about having the conversations with sort of other folks and figuring out who's trying to sort of navigate these various structures. Anything, Adrianna, you'd add on the double dipping?
No, I think, one of the very specific aspects of workforce funding a lot of times just takes some nuanced understanding, which to Jason's point, is what an intermediary organization such as BloomBoard can be so helpful with. It's just, our workforce boards are doing the same as us, trying to make sure that they are utilizing funding appropriately, not crossing any wires. And so it's just about partnering with them to get creative and continuing to dive into the nuances of each of these funding streams, which, as school districts wear a million hats, we are trying to prevent you all from also having to become workforce funding experts. So Jamie Lynn, particular to your question, I would have to ask some very detailed funding stream questions to you. Please feel free to email me if you would like to talk further, but that would require just a little bit more specificity. And Jason, I think we have a hand raised. Darlene looks like there's a question.
I think you can come off mute now, Darlene, if you can chat, if we figure this out. Darlene, are you able to come off chat or come off mute? Or if there are other questions at the moment? Aiko, did I get that right? I think I just gave you a chance. Now I think you can unmute if you want to ask your question. Or if you can write it in the chat. If you can't come off mute and you want to just write it in the chat, you can do that as well. Other questions, other thoughts, comments, concerns? How have you all sort of felt like this, accessing these funds? If you had conversations with your workforce board, it sounds like we've got a couple of folks that have. Other things that have been helpful. And we're sort of into the, Adrianna, is there anything else that you have? We're sort of into the Q&A side of the conversation. So happy to open this up and just sort of answer questions y'all might have, or sort of start to dig into some of the questions that worked. Rhonda, to your question around sort of school districts in Washington State. So we've had a couple of different conversations with schools in Washington State. The bigger question in Washington is actually more of the reciprocity and the licensure question. So in our lens, we're obviously trying to navigate state by state licensure. And so that would be the better question, is sort of what specific areas are you looking for, and what sort of, we don't have an in-state partner in Washington right now, but we have looked at some of the reciprocity structures to allow that to work. And so that would be a question of just sort of what does that look like? And sort of, Washington is part of the same question that I answered earlier around Colorado. Washington is part of the sort of the new teacher reciprocity compact that sort of came out. And so there is some work with SREB and some of the national sort of powers that be to try to create better sort of aligned reciprocity systems that are much more streamlined. And so once you have a license from one state, you can sort of port that in without a ton of extra, sort of transcript reviews and the like. And so Washington is able to use one of our out-of-state partners, right? As long as it's sort of, but the candidate would have to have get the out-of-state license in the process to be able to sort of make that work. Sister Patricia, yes, we do have a partner in Western PA. Actually, Point Park is our university partner. And so we have a whole bunch of work happening with AIU and the Western PA sort of world. And so super excited about sort of that, about that work. And so please feel free to reach out if you want to sort of connect us, if you want us to connect us with that. From Sue, many of our apprentices are looking for personal funding since they aren't able to keep working multiple jobs while completing the program. Are any of your funding streams appropriate for this situation? This is the real question that we come up with over and over again, right? Is like, you're still working multiple jobs and trying to do nights and weekends courses. I think fundamentally, we've tried to solve that problem by removing the nights and weekends requirements. And so vast majority of our candidates stay employed in exactly whatever they're currently employed in, because you only need, typically we find candidates are taking an hour or two a week of sort of outside of workday time to complete their entire degrees and to complete all the full-time course load, because so much of that course load can be embedded in their job. Certainly in some of that apprenticeship, in some of that workforce funding that Adrianna mentioned, there are ways to fund individual personal costs, whether that's childcare, transportation. And so there's a bunch of different ways to sort of access some of that funding. There are requirements on that. So it may take your candidates going to your local workforce board office, taking some TABE tests, taking some other sort of testing sort of structures, and then making sure that they're eligible for that additional funding. And so there's some extra hoops to jump through in there that we're happy to share that you can sort of look up in terms of some of those different line items. The individual training account often sort of comes, there's a bunch of flexibility in there in the process because it's so attached to the individual and because you've already passed the placement requirements in there. And so that would be definitely one to sort of look at. But again, I think the broader lens is, right, how do you sort of embed the actual apprenticeship program in the degree into the job so that there's not sort of the need for nights and weekends or for sort of quitting your second job, third job, if you need to. There's a question, is there a way to ensure employees stay with you if you invest funds in them? So yes, so every candidate we have in the program today signs an MOA with the school district saying that they will commit to, typically it's 3 to 5 years of future employment in exchange for covering the costs of the tuition in exchange for the district's investment. And so we know that that's one of these ways that, we've definitely stood up. Your business office, your CFO will always, sort of probably bring up, there's some questions as like, is that sort of legal? Is that sort of possible? What's the enforcement and how are you going to go sort of find those? I would say what we find by and large is that is very rarely the exception rather than the rule. And that what we often find is candidates are so appreciative of the district investment in them. I mean, again, often what we find is your principals in every single school in the country today knows that there is a para or a long-term sub or a cafeteria monitor who would be a great teacher, who understands, who knows the kids, who really sort of has a calling to work with kids. And that those folks, have run into lots of life barriers in terms of getting a bachelor's degree. And so the idea that the district is all of a sudden going to help accommodate not only that degree into their job, but also pay for it, creates a level of loyalty and appreciation that I think we have not seen in lots of other places. And it's really amazing. We have a bunch of testimonial videos we can share of candidates just talking about how life-changing the access to the program is. And so that would be one of the sort of things I would sort of largely sort of argue is, right, if you're taking somebody who's already been working in your school, who kids go to your schools, right, who's already a part of the community and already has housing and already has all the barriers, the likelihood is that they're actually going to stay much longer than somebody if you're coming from an alt-cert program or recruiting somebody from out of the community in the process. And so we can certainly lock them in from an MOA, from a contractual standpoint, but I think it's more about the sort of the real loyalty that comes from that investment and what that looks like in the process. The question from Terry, any ideas for building and supporting a bilingual or special ed teacher pipeline where currently certified teachers are supported with adding bilingual or special ed certification in their teaching areas? So we do have university partners today that have bachelor's degrees in special ed. ESL, there's typically mostly an add-on across the country, but the special ed is often the first place we start with almost all of our districts because it's such a huge liability that is looming and it's such a high need area. And so it's also sort of fits the sense of, if you're going to make an investment from a board approval standpoint, if you're going to make an investment of that lap salary, there's probably no better liability reducing, value creating, right? Sort of, from an instructional, from a student standpoint, way to spend those funds than in your existing pipeline of people who can become special ed teachers. And that's been really sort of interesting. So certainly we're happy to sort of chat about, the work that we're doing in special ed. And that, that's also a state specific question. So in some states, you can't get a bachelor's degree in special ed, you have to just get add-on. And so there are some questions there in terms of the state licensure sort of processes. I know New Jersey is one of those, right? There's a couple of states that you're not able to get initial licensure with special ed at the bachelor's level. But again, happy to sort of talk through those. And we know that that's really often a place where we're starting in the process. And even in states like Florida, we're adding as many of the different reading endorsements, bilingual endorsements we can into the bachelor's degree as part of that initial licensure as well. And so happy to share more if there's other questions.
Yeah, Jason, Tammy was also asking specifically about for current certified teachers, those add-on certs.
Oh, yeah.
Which is something we can provide as well, correct?
That's right. And you are able to do, that is where the apprenticeship funding has really sort of come across the spectrum. So there are a lot of graduate level, right, sort of pathways that are sort of alt-cert pathways or MAT pathways in special ed that you can do for provisionally certified teachers to get them into fully certified positions, and that you can use some of that apprenticeship funding, use that incumbent worker funding. All of these sort of different funding sources are not necessarily sort of directed solely at the bachelor's level. They can be eligible for the master's, for the graduate level, for the add-on level. It just depends on your local context and the policies. Question in here, how do you create a process that ensures equity and access if we have limited funds to protect us from claims of favoritism or discrimination? Yeah, so Adrianna, you were talking a little about sort of how the letter of law around where you are on the discrimination.
Yeah, absolutely. Here, right, it's about finding, I would say there's really kind of threefold here that we've seen. So, the eligibility requirements for each of these funding streams is very clear, set out in statute, and your local workforce board will have very clear policy around that. So that takes away some of the kind of favoritism, discrimination around which candidates are going to be eligible for which funding stream, right? That's an eligibility question. Additionally, the support that BloomBoard provides in leading school districts through application and selection processes is a very vetted, phased, anti-discriminatory set of policies and procedures. Workforce boards are an excellent asset here, though, as well. They have a ton of experience and a ton of procedures around ensuring equitable processes for selecting candidates, recruitment processes. So aside from being able to support funding, they have all kinds of experience in this across industries as well. Jason, is there anything that you would add?
Yeah, I would say the biggest way that we navigate this today is actually by taking as wide an aperture up front as to the candidate level of interest and being able to say, so if you survey your paras or you survey your classified staff today and say, okay, what roles, right? Where are you? What roles are you sort of interested in terms of special ed, in terms of licensures? Often what we find that districts are getting pretty creative about just saying, all right, well, we're going to fund candidates and we're going to put funding into candidates based on the highest need areas that we have. And you will guaranteed, right? The more you restrict exactly what we're going to look for and say, okay, well, we're only going to fund special ed degrees, right? There's a certain number of your candidates who say, okay, I don't want a special ed degree. I'm not going to be able to I'm going to select out. Or I'm only going to fund, right, sort of special ed degrees in high need schools. And that's sort of folks, well, I'm already working in this school. My kids go here. I don't want to sort of go change schools. And so it's really sort of being able to sort of start with a very wide aperture and then design the process to sort of be able to say like, all right, we're still going to ensure equity and access, and we're still going to ensure that we're not making any sort of claims of favoritism, but here's the roles that we're going to define, and here's what level of funding we have to commit to this. And so we're going to match those up in ways that really allow it to be much more aligned in the process and defensible from a board, right, from a WIOS standpoint in the process. And so there's more, sort of art to science in there, but there's definitely some very clear parameters you can make to make that work. Question from Jack. So if we have an employee that goes to one of those 16 universities, they would first have to apply to the education department of that state first, and then apply to Colorado as an out-of-state teacher. Yeah, so the out-of-state, the teacher reciprocity compact, that's for once you achieve full license. And so we have some universities that allow for teachers out of state to earn student teaching, right, sort of requirements in the process. That's again state specific. So all 16 of those universities wouldn't be eligible for that, but some of them would. And the question would be is then they would go through and they would take Florida tests, right, in the process, and they'd be able to sort of earn a full license from an out-of-state institution from that state, and then be able to sort of port that license over. And it's just a way to sort of help sort of navigate some of the reciprocity. We see, especially teachers in sort of the border states, it comes up quite a bit because, right, it's sort of weird that you can't be, you can't really do your student teaching in a state that's just 10 minutes, in another state 10 minutes away, even though you're sort of working or living in that state. And so there's ways to help navigate that as well.
And your candidates would receive that kind of information and support directly, depending on which university they were attending, and as well as your specific in-state policies.
Any final questions in our last 2 minutes here? No. From Kimberly, there are many campuses in high need areas who depend on guest teacher subs or private long-term instruction for our students. This is a great source to remove barriers for those guest teachers who want to become certified. Thank you. Well, yes, I would agree. Like if you have any way, shape, or form of a guest teacher or an associate teacher, a long-term sub program, this is very likely to be the future of your pipeline, because it is the best path to create the highest quality sort of residency-like structures at the bachelor's level to unlock a bunch of access. And so that's really where we're especially seeing a lot of sort of growth just in candidate interest. And it's a great way to restock your para pond, right? The idea that you can sort of recruit paras into the role, into a long-term sub role, and restock your para pond by having a para and a bachelor's degree program. That's exactly what Amazon and Target and other folks are using to steal our teachers. And so the idea that districts should all of a sudden be able to fight back and say, well, if you want to go to work for Target, they'll buy you a bachelor's degree, but you're going to stock shelves. Or you can come work for the district, we'll buy you a bachelor's degree, and you're going to really impact kids' lives. And you have your summers off, and there's a bunch of flexibility, right? And it's a great community. That's really the goal. Anything else? Well, just knowing everybody's time is super precious. So we really appreciate y'all joining us here. Thanks for a great conversation and a bunch of questions for all engaged. Certainly let us know if you have questions. We'll share out a recording of this presentation, and then we'll share out those slides as well. And again, we really appreciate all the time. And if you have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. My email is just jason@BloomBoard. I think Adrianna put hers in the chat as well. And so we're happy to sort of talk through any questions you might have. Really appreciate it. Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of the week.